let's begin. So, thanks for all being here. I definitely would have thought only a few years ago that I wouldn't be giving this talk. So it's kind of exciting to be here and to see that people have turned up. The path it took me to get here was kind of long and not all that straightforward. So we're going to wind through the most interesting parts of that this afternoon. And I'm also going to be giving you some exam relevant content, study tips, and of course the bonus notes that I promised anyone who turned up live for the session. So my story began about 5 years ago when I was still in high school. And would you believe it or not, I actually felt very lost in English. I didn't really know what I was doing, or so it felt, but I wanted to do really well. So I started scouring the internet and every library I could find for resources. I did every prompt that my teacher gave me, which ended up being a lot of prompts, and I read everything I could as well. In the end, I was very pleased because I got a study score of 50, which, to be honest, I'm still surprised by to this day. It still doesn't feel 100% like it happened. And I always say it must have been the fear of God my teacher put in me because I wasn't nearly as stressed for any of my other subjects. When I graduated, I had pretty good results, so naturally I started tutoring. Except it turned out that I wasn't that good at it. And I found that it felt like I was back at school. I was spending hours and hours reading all these new books because the ones that I'd done in school had just gone off the book list, and even more time trying to find analysis on them, trying to read what other critics had said about these texts. In particular, there was hardly any information on newer texts or those by Australian authors. You guys have probably found this doing research on The Dressmaker. It's much harder to find stuff than it is for the Crucible. And it would be years before this changed. The resources that are available now are much better than the ones that were back in 2018. Slowly, the years passed, and I started learning that English was actually quite teachable. You just have to be able to convey a couple of core tenets. First of all, you need to make sure you know the text very well. So you can't have any gaps in your knowledge of the plot or things like that. Secondly, you have to be able to write in a structured way, so everything you're saying has to make sense. Thirdly is analysis, so you have to be able to show why certain characters do certain things. And then lastly, you want to be able to adapt plans to new related topics. So once you know the text, can write in a structured way and explain some of the analysis, you have to be able to adapt the certain kinds of explanation you do to all the different topics that you might get in an exam. And then lastly, if you want a really top grade, you have to be able to say something interesting about the author's intentions. So while those things might sound a little bit nebulous, if you break them down step by step, it actually becomes not too hard to do. I pretty soon realized that I was teaching all my students the same sorts of things. And in fact, maybe there was a better way of teaching than just one-on-one sessions once a week. So, after all, I was writing the same essay plans with each student. The only really unique thing that each student needed was essay feedback and the chance to ask questions. Other than that, everyone got pretty much the same content. So that's where we're going to leave the story of my development as a tutor for the time being. You know plenty about me, so we can begin with the substantive content. So, my time as a student and then later as a teacher showed that mostly teachers just read through the book in class and not that much time is devoted to essay writing or essay themes. So I like to start writing and themes as soon as possible when teaching students, which is why we're going to jump straight into it today. So I'm assuming you know the background for both of the texts. You've probably done a bunch of writing on them already. First theme we're going to look at is humanity. For each of these plans, I've tried to make them as broad as possible so that they're usable for multiple topics. What I want you to be able to do is take the broad concepts that I've given you and then adapt the topic sentences depending on the topic you've got. but you should be able to still keep most of the evidence the same. At the same time, however, I didn't want to cut on quality. So what you'll notice is some of the example paragraphs that I've given are quite long. They have a bit more evidence in them than you would actually need. So all you've got to do is just pick and choose the examples that are more relevant for different topics when you're writing your own pieces. So with that out of the way, the humanity topic that I wrote on is quite similar to one of the 2022 VCAR prompts. Compare how the dangers of a lack of kindness are examined in the two texts. So for this, we're going to talk about, first of all, a lack of kindness or self-interest on an individual level. The next thing that's good to do is look at the same lack of kindness, but on a more societal level. So we're going to look at selfish or unkind individuals and then selfish or unkind societies. So both of them, as you can see, are quite broad topics. And lastly, a contrast paragraph on how sometimes people are kind and they're rewarded for that. So for the first prompt, for the first paragraph, self-interest both in everyday life and under pressure leads to negative consequences. So for the Crucible, your key examples for this are probably going to be people like Putnam and Paris. So the key quotes I'd use to show this for Putnam is that he was a man with many grievances and a vindictive nature, which eventually led to him killing his neighbours for their land, as Giles Corey put it. Another good quote you can add in if you want as well is when he says, "I'll clap a writ on you." So this is particularly good for showing that he's not afraid to use the law or legal standards for his own ends. Likewise, Paris is a really classic example of this. So even before the crisis, he cut a villainous path and there's very little good to be said for him. He frequently felt insulted by others, and despite being a preacher, at the very least, Proctor sees no light of God in that man. Some other things you can bring up are his obsession with money. So the fact that previously he was a businessman and he left that to, as he says, serve the Lord, although he does now complain about spending £6 on firewood. Another good thing to bring up is the fact that he is always complaining about wanting golden candlesticks. So it's something Proctor brings up to Hale when he visits him at his house. For the dressmaker, on the other hand, two good examples are Evan Pettyman and Trudy. So for Pettyman, basically any quote you can bring up that shows that he's a horrible guy is going to be pretty good at showing his self-interest or lack of kindness. So for example, that people turn their backs on him when they saw him coming, that he abuses his wife, and that the result of that is that she's described as having a startled bearing. You could also use the quote of her having a nervous rash. And also you can use the example of him sending Tilly away in order to hurt Molly. On the other hand, you could also use Trudy. So, some examples for Trudy is that she guilt trips William into marrying her. So, by saying, "What about my reputation?" A few days before the wedding, he wants to back out, and she convinces him to keep going along with it. When she does get married to him, however, one of the first things she does is looks in the mirror and say to herself, "I'm Mrs. William Beaumont of Windswept Crest." So you can see from that she has quite a self-important, egotistical approach to life. Everything's about her and her status and position. And obviously the results of this is that William becomes miserable. So he's described as slumped and he starts drinking and smoking. And eventually one night in a bar, he confesses that having a baby is horrible and that he doesn't really love his wife. If you want to add some symbols into this paragraph, I'd also talk about Macbeth. So it's kind of ironic that Trudy is directing a play about murder and ambition, which is actually a quote that they use to describe it from The Dressmaker. So you can talk about how that's kind of ironic because she herself is heading up in society and she's just about to fall and tumble down, much like Macbeth in the tragedy. So that's kind of ironic, and a good quote for her and the power going to her head is, "I can do anything I want." So in short, how you want to sum this up is that the lack of kindness is seen on an individual level in the text, and the kinds of ways we see it are slightly different in the two texts. Paragraph 2 is more focused on society. So I'd say a rigid approach to outsiders and the disenfranchised is also dangerous for societies. So for the Crucible, We've got the subjugation of the girls, tituba, and the incapacity of the politicians and the leaders to hear the opinions of others. So, for example, this is a really good quote to show why the witch hunt started in the first place, because the children or the young girls were only ever permitted to walk straight, eyes slightly lowered, and that they were forbidden to talk unless spoken to. That's probably one of the key reasons why the whole witch hunt started at all, because in effect, it's the rebellion of the girls against the restraint of the society they're in. You can also bring up tituba if you want. So I would here talk about how the fact that she's a slave leads to her being a scapegoat within the society, and the fact that she only claims she sees the devil, really, because she has at least 2 or 3 separate people threaten to kill her if she doesn't. So obviously you don't have much of a choice in that situation. It's the oppression of groups like this that leads to things like the witch hunts, and that's why a societal lack of kindness is a problem for societies. The other things you can just bring up is that the subjugation of the girls, the young girls in particular, is what led to, as Miller describes it, a perverse manifestation of panic when the balance began to turn towards greater individual freedom. And lastly, if you just want one extra point to show how outsiders are affected, you can talk about how the first people who are named are Sarah Good and Goody Osborne. So these are 2 characters who are of not particularly high standing in the play. One is a drunk and I think one's a beggar. And both of them are named because they don't really have any friends in the world. So how I would frame this Crucible argument is that having a lack of kindness towards outsiders or towards people who don't have that much power within society ends up being dangerous because of the way they'll rebel against that. The same kind of thing is seen in The Dressmaker. So inequality for women and no formal method for them to remedy this leads to personally imposed revenge. So this is a reason why the legal system exists, which is kind of something you can bring up if you want. One of the reasons for the legal system, as it's kind of developed in England, the US, and Australia, is to prevent people taking out their own revenge. Because if people did that, then everyone would be fighting all the time. So having an external body which can adjudicate disputes helps avoid that. In The Dressmaker, we don't have that though. So women don't really have too many options for divorce. And even if they were to get divorced, they'd face so much societal backlash that it's not really an option for them. So for these women, what they have to do is take out their own revenge. For Marigold, she puts poison in Evan's cup and cuts his tendons. And if you want a symbol in this paragraph, you can talk about how the red puddle across her polished lino represents her liberation. So if you remember from the start of the text, Marigold was obsessed with cleaning. She was nervous all the time. She scrubbed everything that got touched or had fingerprints. She had to clean all the doorknobs all the time. The fact that she's, at the end, able to watch blood, which is something messy and horrific, spread all the way across her flooring, shows how much she's changed, how much she's become possibly even unhinged and completely liberated from that previous obsessive prison that she was in. If you want another example, you can talk about the implication that Irma kind of killed Mr. Almanac a little bit, her husband as well. So he tumbled past her when he was like on the walk of the fall that led to him dying in the creek. So in this case, we have 2 women who take revenge out on abusive husbands because there's no formal means for them to do this. You can also note, if you want, that Tilly was kind of involved in both cases, or at least seemed to think it was a good thing after both of them happened. And if you want your last example, Tilly turns her pain into her catalyst and propeller. So that's something, one of the last things she says before she decides to burn down the town. Then, for our last paragraph, we've talked about unkindness in individuals, unkindness in societies, and I tend to find it's nice to have a bit of a contrasting paragraph. So, on the flip side, we have the dangers of unkindness, but we also have that people who are kind either do good for the world or are rewarded themselves. So, in the Crucible, Rebecca knows that she's going to be okay because she feels like she's doing right by God. She's following her beliefs. So she says, "Let you fear nothing, another judgment waits us all." Elizabeth also seems to be a good wife. She seems to be forgiving of Proctor and willing to mend their relationship, and her extending that olive branch ends up being positive for their relationship and also for Proctor's sense of self. She says, "It were a cold house I kept." But something you can bring up in your essay if you want is whether this is something she should really have to admit to or not. Was it really that she kept a cold house that prompted Proctor's lechery, as they call it, or was it more something to do with Proctor's own character? So that's something you can debate either side as you wish. A related point is Proctor holding himself to a higher standard than the other characters who've been accused of witchcraft and deciding to stand up against it. So if you want to bring this up, you can. However, I would just note that it's not so much that he shows kindness as that he shows resolve. So if you are going to bring that point up, just make sure that you set it aside from the other ones a little bit, because he does it more for himself than for other people, aside from the fact that he wants his kids to be able to stand up in the world and bear the name Proctor without feeling embarrassed about it. On the other hand, for the dressmaker, we've got some other good examples of people who do good for the world. So Irma and May send food up to Molly, and there's a few good quotes for that. Tilly looks after Molly and helps her get better. So Tilly claims on multiple occasions that she saves Molly's life. And lastly, probably the key example is Teddy's kindness towards Tilly helps her open up. And there's heaps and heaps of quotes you can use for this, but one of the more poignant ones I thought was the story of Ormond and Pablo, which she'd only ever told once to Teddy. So you can see in the Crucible, people's ability to be kind is important for those around them and also for their own sense of self. But in the dressmaker, people's kindness is also important for the community around them. And it's got less of an impact on people's own sense of self-worth. They don't really feel better or worse about themselves for helping as they do in the Crucible. They more feel like they've done something like out of duty for someone else, at least in Irma and May's case. And then for Teddy, there's more personal elements to that, but it's more that he wants to be friends with Tilly than the fact that he wants to feel like a good person. So in that sense, he's different to Proctor. So we've covered self-interest on an individual level, societal self-interest or lack of kindness, and then rewards for being kind or the benefits of being kind. What I've done here is tried to show a couple of topics that might work with this essay plan. So ideally, with the prompt that I've given you, you can see that the individual selfishness, societal lack of kindness, and times when people are kind and rewarded for it works quite well for a lot of related topics. So for this one, compare the ways in which the Crucible and the Dressmaker explore people's capacity for selfishness. You can use exactly the same thing: individual selfishness, societal selfishness, and benefits of being selfless. It's exactly the same thing. All you have to do is change the topic sentence and the linking sentence. Same thing for this one here. Compare how the idea of self-interest is examined in the two texts. It's almost exactly the same as this prompt. The VCAR 2022 one, compare how a lack of generosity causes trouble for everyone. We talked about a lack of kindness, so obviously very applicable. All you'll see is that if you change your topic sentences to match the new prompt, then you're immediately good to go. The same evidence still applies. It's kind of like magic, I find. All right, so we've talked about me, we've ticked off humanity. Now we're going to have a look at judgment. So judgment's the next theme that I wanted you guys to have a look at. It was pretty hard to choose which themes to talk about because there are a lot in both texts, and I couldn't really have much scope to talk about more than 3. But again, I've tried to keep my responses to all 3 prompts quite broad, so you should be able to use them to apply it to multiple topics. But they're still relevant enough that if you kind of worded it properly, it was clearly explained, you could get like a 9 or 10 out of 10 for these pieces. So, judgment. This is another prompt that I wrote, Everybody knows everything about everyone, but no one ever tittle-tattles because then someone else will tell on them. Compare how the Crucible and the Dressmaker explore the role of judgment within communities. This is actually a really good quote from Molly. So you can use this in a lot of essays, actually. It's kind of long, so you'll have to work out which parts are the most relevant and which parts you'd cut out. But I find it very telling of what the society's like in the text. So would recommend that one. So in order to respond to questions about judgment, again, you can follow kind of like an individual society contrast structure to it. So here I started with a societal one because it kind of matched better like the beginning of the text, so I could have a more chronological approach. So first of all, one of the roles of judgment within communities is a means of control. So it's a very effective way to control a society if you have these set standards that everyone will be judged for if they don't adhere to them. So that's the first one. Secondly, self-directed judgment. So a lot of characters judge themselves or police themselves more than the others around them do. Lastly, however, we have examples in both texts of people who are able to break free from judgment. And so that's our contrast paragraph for this topic. First idea, judgment within the towns is used as a means of control. So in the Crucible, obviously what it's about is religious restrictions. Though you can talk about their parochial snobbery, their autocracy, their ideology being the reason and justification for all their sufferings. And if you want some examples from actual characters, I'd pick Proctor not being able to recite his commandments and the fact that Hale responds by telling him that theocracy is a fortress and no gap in it is too small to be not counted. I would also talk about Paris. So there's either obedience or the church will burn. So you can see the means of judgment for control in the Crucible is the religious standards that are used to control people. On the other hand, in the Dressmaker, the standards that people hold are a little bit different. It's not so much religious, it's more to do with people's social class and also their gender roles as well. So the main effect of controlling people with judgment is to ostracize outsiders and blackmail people. So you'll probably notice in the Dressmaker that there's a lot of standards that people are held to or that people are supposedly held to, but which aren't actually enforced. So we have a lot of people, so for example, Sergeant Farrett's cross-dressing, Nancy and Ruth's secret relationship, even Faith O'Brien and Reginald Blood having their affair. Everyone knows about everything, but no one confronts these people about the fact that they're going against the expected standards. However, these standards are held very closely up to outsiders or people that aren't accepted by the town. So part of the reason why Tilly is ostracized is because, well, the town don't like her, but their justification for that is that she's an illegitimate child, she's cursed. They apply all these expectations about how women should be to her mother and to her. And as a result of that, they use that as a justification for excluding her, even if they don't apply the same thing to their own people. So you can talk about any examples from behavioral restrictions, secrets, hypocrisy, etc. For Teddy, I like this quote that nice girls loved him, but he was a McSwiney. So there's no hope for him really because he's always going to be lower class. You can talk about how everyone turns to look when Tilly and Teddy go out, and the fact that when Gertrude gives birth, Beulah Harradine, who's always there to gossip, no matter what's going on, says she's only been married 8 months. So we've got two types of judgment. In both towns, judgment by society is used as control. In the Crucible, it's more religious, but in the Dressmaker, it's more to do with social expectations for marriage and expectations for how people should behave in a non-religious fashion. For my second paragraph, I'd talk about how the judgment characters impose on each other can produce internalized judgment, shame, and guilt. So, first paragraph was about how societies control people through social expectations, this paragraph is more about how individuals police themselves. So, for example, Proctor was against the moral fashion of the time in his affair, but also against his own vision of decent conduct. And probably the best quote for Proctor is that he's come to regard himself as a kind of fraud. So here's your key example of someone who feels internalized judgment or shame as a result of his actions. On the other hand, in The Dressmaker, even though everyone kind of knows what's going on, people still self-police because of the judgment that they fear from others. So it's not so much that society actually imposes judgment on them, like they do for Tilly, for example. Like, people are outwardly cruel to Tilly and Teddy, say. However, other characters who are more accepted still self-police. So, for example, Sergeant Farrett only cross-dresses inside the house, even though probably everyone knows. So Gertrude has a sly secret smile when he's buying cloth. She knows what he's going to do with it. Likewise, Nancy and Ruth scrambled when Beulah was coming. So they know that there's going to be gossip going around, and so they don't want to be seen together. And lastly, we've got at Gertrude's wedding, Elsbeth is explaining to a woman who's come to visit from Melbourne why Gertrude has such a fancy dress. And she says that Gertrude's family move in commercial circles. So Elsbeth doesn't want to admit that she thinks that her new daughter-in-law is basically a pig. She pretty much says as much throughout the text. She wants to keep up a face in front of others. So in The Crucible, we have Proctor beating himself up and judging himself. And then in The Dressmaker, we don't see people beating themselves up for how they are so much, but we do see examples of them hiding who they are from society because they don't want to be judged. At least in the same way that other characters are outwardly judged, like Tilly and Teddy. Then, again, for our last paragraph, another contrast paragraph is good. So, nonetheless, it's possible to let go of judgment, both towards others and the self, and this is better both for individuals and their relationships with others. So, benefits of letting go of judgment, either of yourself or of the people around you. Proctor, he forgives himself. He feels better about himself. Elizabeth forgives Proctor, and that repairs the relationship between them. So both of them are able to view themselves in a better light and also able to repair the relationship between them. In The Dressmaker, it's slightly different. So we've got Tilly lets go of what the town thinks of her and ultimately becomes happier. She sleeps lightly for the first time when she decides to take her revenge. She's happy almost at the end when she's finishing their costumes. And finally, before she lights the fire and sets everything alight, she's described as being wreathed in a brilliant halo with shafts of light around her. So this is a good symbol you can use if you want to talk about her liberation and her freedom as a result of deciding to take revenge. You can also say that as she goes through, she lets out all the animals. So it's not like really what she does isn't cruel against people who haven't wronged her, but she does take out the rest of the town. Likewise, Sergeant Farrett's a good example of someone who decides to stop caring. So he says he's beyond caring what people think, and that he knows everyone's seen what's on his clothesline anyway. So he decides to stop judging himself, to come out in public in a dress at Molly's funeral. Although you can kind of question whether Sergeant Farrett really does stop thinking or stop caring what the townspeople think. Until the very last minute, he still seems reasonably happy to go along with their play. And he seems to want to run back to stop Tilly setting everything on fire. So at the very least, he doesn't understand her motivations for doing that. Or possibly it's just that he wants to save his own dresses. Lastly, if you want some kind of edge characters to back this up, an interesting one is Mona and Leslie. So Mona and Leslie never really fell in love or intended to get married. The only reason they did get married was because there was a mishap with Mona's dress and people thought that they'd slept together. So they were basically forced into a marriage to avoid the shame. It wasn't really a marriage of love. It wasn't even a marriage of convenience. It was a marriage of making everyone else around them happy rather than themselves. Both of them are misfits, however. The first few days of their marriage seem quite unhappy until they finally discuss, how they got there and what they're going to do now. And they laugh when they realize that no one else wants this, but they decide that they're going to do the best that they can together. So this is another really good example of people deciding to let go of the judgment of others towards them or of them towards themselves, and either to build relationships with each other or to feel better. So Crucible, you've got one example. Dressmaker, you've got the other, and you've just got to outline the slight differences between them in your body paragraphs. So again, some topics that might work with this. Compare how both texts explore that the judgment from others influences our understanding of ourselves. So you can adapt to what we just talked about. Judgment from others affects societies in general because people are held to certain standards, and judgment from others leads to self-policing and a feeling of not being able to be your true self and hiding from the outside world. Likewise, compare the role of judgment in the two texts. Super broad, you can do exactly the same thing. Societal judgment, internal judgment, benefits of breaking free. And what's most important is how an individual judges themselves. Compare how the Crucible and the Dressmaker explore this idea. So in this case, I'd maybe flip the middle and the first paragraph around. I'd start by saying there's detriments when characters judge themselves. However, judgment from society can also be bad. And then lastly, I'd say people who are able to break free of this and stop judging themselves or stop fearing the judgment of others will ultimately be the happiest. All right, so we've talked about me. I've given you a good plan for humanity. You've also got a solid plan on judgment. And there's another anything topic. So this last topic is quite special. There were 8 to 10 themes for the Crucible and the Dressmaker, and it was not easy picking which ones I'd go through. I kind of felt like 3 wasn't really enough to cover everything. So in the end, what I decided to do was give you guys a plan that I've used quite a few times, which, quite magically, is readily applicable to maybe 60% of topics. So I call this the good for anything plan, because more often than not, you can adapt it to whatever topic you need. So how does the good for anything plan work? If you want a plan that works for 90% or all topics, what you need to do is lead the examiner through the text. Explain what each author shows about the progression of the societies they write about. So we start at the beginning. Each author outlines towns with unrealistic expectations. In the middle, we see the effects of these harsh standards, the negative things that are produced. And in the end, we see the occasional ability of individuals to win or to take revenge. So just note, particularly with this last topic, this is an example of a time when our topic sentence will highlight a difference between the authors. So usually, you've probably noticed from my examples so far, my topic sentence broadly addresses both texts as being pretty much the same. And when I highlight the differences and compare them in more detail, that's going to be in the body paragraphs, in the actual evidence and analysis and how I talk through it. Here though, because we have 2 quite different endings, I would outline the fact that the 2 endings are different in my 3rd paragraph in the topic sentence. So I would say that Miller shows that occasionally individuals are able to win, and on the other hand, Ham doesn't necessarily show that individuals can win, but they can liberate themselves from bad situations and take revenge, whether or not that's a good thing. So, body paragraph 1. In the beginning of the text, we're presented with 2 differently toxic towns which adhere rigidly to particular social standards. So the Crucible, this is all about religion. So I'd use any of these quotes here that show the rigidity of which religion is applied in the Crucible and the strong standard that everyone's expected to hold to. Some good ones here are that Goody Osborne is convicted because she never knew no commandments. So the fact that you might break away or not be completely up to date with religion can be a reason for basically hanging you or taking you out of society. Also, Hale's quote that theology is a fortress and no crack in a fortress may be accounted small. It shows that there's no real space in which gaps are acceptable. If you want, Danforth here is talking more about the law than about religion, but they're kind of the same in the Crucible. So you can use this quote about the ocean of salt tears if you want as well. However, I would also note, when talking about the way that this is toxic, these social standards, that these religious standards are impossible to adhere to. So there's all manner of licentious people in the village, and there's a bunch of other quotes that show that no one, or not everyone, really adheres to what they're supposed to. But at the same time that there's no tolerance for other opinions. With the dressmaker, on the other hand, it's not so much religion, but again, what we talked about, those expectations for women, gender roles, marriage as a way to solve gossiping, and other frowning on people who don't quite fit in to the normal marriage expectations. So for women, Tilly's ostracized as a murderess and for being illegitimate. People ask if she has her mother's loose ways. When Evan Pettyman feels like he can't be a man anymore because he's impotent, this is a good example of someone who feels like they've lost that aspect of gender that makes them important in a society. And then there's this fantastic quote that marriage is the way to solve everything, which is pretty much shown to be true, and also at the same time shown by Ham, I think, to be completely ridiculous. So Mona and Leslie are forced into a quiet ceremony, and Gertrude bullies William into marrying her by asking, "What about my reputation?" This is probably one of your key social standards that's really enforced in a detrimental way in The Dressmaker. I think Ham's really quite cynical about the marriage expectations of the 1950s, the way that they were applied as if it was such a simple fix to something like having a child out of wedlock was to marry the person who was the child's father. And also just any gossiping in general. So Gertrude and William haven't even slept together by the time she bullies him into marriage, despite the fact that there's all this gossip going around. Then, of course, we've got Sergeant Farrett and his cross-dressing, and we've got Nancy and Ruth again. So examples we've already gone over. So that's how I'd talk about the beginning of the text, and this, again, is applicable to a lot of prompts. Then you can talk about the middle. So the middle is more like the dangerous result of these impossible standards, and also of the people who break them, and the fact that this is a bad thing, basically. So all the jealousy that Putnam and Abigail have creates the witch hunts. Paris's selfish desire to keep his position also contributes to the witch hunts. And Danforth and Hathorne's obsession with order and religion leads them to sentence people to hang. Postponement, Danforth says, speaks of floundering on my part, and he claims that he should hang 10,000 that dared to rise against the law. In The Dressmaker, we see similar things. So the dangerous consequences of these impossible standards include hypocrisy, so the fact that no one really adheres to standards and everyone else knows it. Gossip, symbolized by Beulah, so you can talk about her as a really good example of that. The weaponization of social standards against outsiders, so that's what we were talking about earlier. People don't use social standards against people they like. For example, Faith and Reginald. Basically, they have their affair, aside from Mr. Almanac, the chemist, who decides to give them bleach for their STIs. But people talk about Molly's loose ways. So Molly is an outsider. Tilly, her daughter, is also an outsider, which is why they're held to the standard, even though the other people in the town aren't. If you want to add a bit of author analysis into this, you could possibly talk about how outsiders threaten the inner group, maybe because people don't know as much about them. So part of why everything works in Dungatar goes back to that quote we had earlier from Molly, that everybody knows everything about everyone, but no one ever tittle-tattles, because then someone will tell on them. What Molly's basically saying is that the reason why Dungatar works is because everyone has blackmail on everyone else. So if you slip up people aren't going to tell on you and gossip about you or throw you out, at least to your face, because you're still part of the group. But if you're an outsider, people don't have as much blackmail on you. There's not as much stuff that they can use to basically get back at you. So perhaps that's why outsiders are a bit of a threat. So that's more of a hypothetical question. You don't have to use that if you don't want, but I personally find that it's an interesting interpretation, and I'd be keen to bring it in my own writing. Last thing you can bring up if you want to talk about consequences of impossible standards is ostracization of individuals. So that's just Tilly. Good example is kicking her out of the ball. And also Teddy. No matter how prized he is as a football player, he's still just a McSwiney. In the end, Miller shows, however, that individuals can achieve temporary wins for society, while Ham suggests that the only option for those who have been most wronged is revenge. So for the Crucible, I'd talk about how individuals can win sometimes. Proctor, Rebecca, and Giles all choose their names over a lie. Rebecca feels okay because heaven will still accept her. Proctor won't give in because it's my name. And Giles died Christian under the law. As a result of these deaths, particularly Proctor's hanging, to all intents and purposes, the power of theocracy in Massachusetts was broken. So in this case, when individuals rise up against the societies that oppress them, they can achieve great results. However, there's doubt about whether any of this will last. So you can bring up the fact that the play itself is an allegory, that it follows a seasonal pattern, that Elizabeth Proctor married again only 4 years after her husband's death, and that a long time after the play ended, factionalism was still alive, and that people who took government benefits, claiming to be victims, often turned out to be informers. So there's a sense that human nature always kind of stays the same in the Crucible. Even if an individual wins something for themselves or for the people around them, or even for their whole community, it probably won't last because human nature is still the same. It's always going to be the same. Same idea for the dressmaker. So Marigold and Irma both kill their husbands. Same quotes as earlier. Gertrude, eventually, William gets sick of her and takes his revenge out on her by threatening her with an asylum. I think he also slaps her. And Tilly burns down the town. So same quotes as before, showing her personal liberation as a result of that. So in terms of analysis for the dressmaker, I would say that perhaps what Ham is suggesting through the end of her text is that in a society which leaves its most vulnerable members without any form of legal or formal recourse, the only available justice is that which the characters mete out themselves. And it's for that reason that characters like Tilly, Marigold, Irma all end up taking revenge. There's no one else that they can turn to. They have to do it themselves. As you can probably see, I like essays that have a contrasting, unique, or novel in some way ending. I feel like it's a nice break from the rest of the contention, and it also shows that you have a nuanced understanding of the text. Because if you have 3 arguments that are all in the same vein, they're all answering yes to the prompt, then sometimes it kind of looks like you haven't considered other alternatives. And most of the time it's good to bring in some alternatives if you can. So with that said, why do I call this an all topics plan? Well, it can work with almost any topic. Humanity and self-interest. Compare how the idea of self-interest is examined in the text. You can talk about the toxic societies at the start that are self-interested, the problems this causes in the middle, the benefits of the individuals rising up at the end. Hypocrisy. Compare what the 2 texts suggest about facades. You can talk about the impossible standards in the beginning, the fact that these facades or these impossible standards cause trouble in the middle, and that people who are able to break away from these facades in the end ultimately benefit. Same thing for good and evil, same thing for toxic societies, and even for power. Compare how Miller and Ham explore the role of authority figures. You can talk about how, in the beginning, the authority figures hold these standards. In the middle, it turns out that the authority figures are quite misguided. that they don't really know what they're doing, and that ends up causing problems for society. And lastly, at the end, that the individuals who are able to confront these authority figures produce a better result either for themselves, the people around them, or the broader community. So, I've told you a little bit about me. We've covered humanity. We've covered judgment. We've had a topic that you can use for almost anything. So I would say if you're stuck and you're not really sure how to write, I would see if this plan can be adapted to any topics I'm looking at. And then if you've got something that's more specific, you can have a look at these as well. Obviously, there are many, many more that I couldn't cover, but I thought those were the most important ones, and also the ones that are most useful or applicable for you in your exam revision. So, with that out of the way, let's just quickly run over how to study, and then I will tell you what the bonus resources are for people who turn up today. So, remember how I told you at the start that I struggled as a tutor initially because I didn't really know how to teach, and slowly I worked out that there was a set number of things students needed to know in order to be able to walk confidently into an exam. What students need to know, what you guys need to revise, is a good knowledge of themes. You need to feel comfortable writing, and you need to have set plans for almost all topics, which can be adapted to almost any other topic. That's the best way that you can walk in feeling confident. I hope that you kind of feel like you have some of these plans now. At least we've covered, 2 and a couple of themes, which you can use, which you can adapt for different topics. And I can promise I spent a lot of hours making this presentation, and the hours that I spent will shave a week off your revision, definitely. Because you don't have to spend the same 10 or 15 hours researching. You just have the answers given to you. But there's one problem with that revision strategy, which is that, as you're probably realizing, in year 12, you don't really have a lot of time to go over everything. It takes hours. And you can trust me, because when I was in year 12, I spent over 120 hours studying for English. And that's kind of the equivalent of one English exam plus another timed essay every single week for 3 terms, which is where we're up to in the year now, without ever skipping a week. So that's a lot of work for English. And if you don't have any guidance, it's especially difficult, because you can spend hours on something and not know whether it's worthwhile or not. But because I've been teaching for so long now, I feel like I'm starting to pick up a little bit how to make English easy, and I really hope to try and convey that in this presentation. I've also been experiencing a little bit of success. So last year, all of my year 12 students gave me positive reviews and said that they wouldn't have been able to get the same improvement without the tips and tricks that I gave them. One student was in the mid-40s at the start of the year, and he got up to 60 and 70% in only a couple of months, which was quite impressive. Last week actually, I was very happy with another student who'd been stuck in the 83 to 85 range for about 18 months. And if any of you guys are there, you know that it's probably quite difficult to break up into that 9 and 10 out of 10 range. She just told me that she got 29 out of 30 on her recent assessment. So that's a 97. It was the highest grade she ever got in English. So I was really happy with that as well. And fortuitously, as I was writing this slide, I got a text from another student who's usually a B to C student, who's just done his first assessment since we started working together, and he got an A. It's very fulfilling for me to realize that I've helped people improving from passing to failing, and also from A students already to A+. So, the question, how to study. If you want to walk into your exam feeling confident, knowing you are completely prepared, and you want to open your scores at the end of the year, find out that they were even better than you'd hoped, I would recommend 1. take small group classes covering all major themes if you can. So that's kind of like what we did today. It'll significantly cut down the time you need to spend researching and finding the best quotes and arguments. You can do it yourself, it just takes longer. You'll have to spend more time studying. So my preparation for these prompts took about 10 hours, as I said. You get exactly the same information for under an hour, which is a pretty good deal for you guys. You also want to, in the next few weeks, write lots of practice plans and essays. You have to feel as comfortable as possible with writing. And lastly, you need to get immediate feedback on your work. So definitely be sending everything you write to your teachers, or if you've got a tutor, to your tutor as well. The fastest way to get better in English is to find out what you're doing wrong as fast as possible. It's also good if you don't have to wait 2 weeks for your teacher to respond, or maybe never if they don't. It's also a problem if your teacher only responds with a couple of vague comments, because that can be hard to work with as well. But the better your feedback you have access to, and the more immediately you can get it, the faster you can progress with your revision. Obviously, most of this you can do on your own, of course, though it does take a lot of time. So in the last 5 days before the English exam, I spent 6 hours a day reading, reviewing plans, and that was just like, in the final days. Before that, I spent all the other time that I mentioned as well. So, which is why, if you want to cut down that time and you want to be a little bit more certain, you have the option of a Crucible Dressmaker blueprint, which I created. So in my emails, this is the second secret project that I was referring to. I spent a long time preparing it, but you guys have been here to see all my free notes and all my work preparing it, basically. So I'm glad that you guys get to hear about it today. You don't have to sign up, obviously, but I'm kind of proud of it, so I'll tell you a little bit about it anyway, before we get to the juiciest part of the lecture, which I've saved for the end. So the program runs for 4 weeks. It's designed to make sure that you always know what you're talking about in an exam, no matter what prompt you get. Anyone who's in it will get 2 classes a week, personally tailored study plans, unlimited essay marking for comparative, and unlimited feedback sessions. So basically it's like one-on-one teaching and also class teaching. You get 2 sessions of content a week, and then if there's anything you don't understand or any feedback you get that you have questions about, you can just send me a message and I'll set up a Zoom to talk with you at whatever time's convenient. So back to our initial question, why would I create free notes then? Remember how I said I struggled in school and a few years ago when I first started teaching because there weren't any really high quality resources online? I realized earlier this year that it was time to fix this, and that's why I started writing notes. You guys are kind of lucky because you're my trial note enjoyers. I've only written out proper notes for argument analysis and the Crucible and The Dressmaker. So in that sense, you guys are the only people who get to benefit. And it's taken me tens and tens of hours to do so. So today, if either the free notes or this session I've just run have helped you, I have 2 asks for you. 1, if you would like to study by yourself in the lead up to the exam, you feel like you know what you're doing, you're on top of everything, you're happy with how everything's going, you feel like everything's kind of smooth, it's all good, please keep enjoying my notes. They're free, they contain all my secrets, really, and I spent a lot of time on them. So if you find them helpful, I would love them. I would love it if you could please pass them on to more people so that other people can access them for free. Every time I get a share request, it means the world to me. I get really happy, so I really appreciate that. And of course, it helps more people who can't pay for tutoring or can't buy study guides to access notes that personally I think are better quality than most study guides and better organized as well. And they go into a lot more detail with things like analysis. People have the option for that. But 2, if you want to pay it forward to another year 12 next year, so I can spend the whole summer writing extra good notes for them, and I don't have to tutor as many one-on-one students in order to do that, and you feel like you'd rather have a bit of guidance in the lead up to the exam, or you're not too keen on doing things by yourself, you want marking for all your essays, here's a snapshot of the level of detail I go into when giving feedback. One of the best kind of reviews I get in my teaching is the degree of feedback and how much more detailed it is than most teachers at school. And you want to be 100% sure that you will improve in comparative by the exam. Then you can sign up for my blueprint. So it's at hellosmart.com.au/contact. There's just a little form. If you fill it in, I'll give you a chat over the phone or on Zoom, and we'll see if you would fit in or not. I'm keeping the groups really small though, so that's why I'm talking with people before getting everyone signed up. And as I said, I can only take a handful of people because I'll die. I already have a lot of private students, so if you do want to be part of it, then make sure to add your details in as soon as possible. And just to recap what it is, 2 classes a week, personally tailored study plans, unlimited essay marking on your comparative, super detailed, and any feedback or clarification sessions, as many of them as you want as well. And if that wasn't good enough, then anyone who signs up before Monday will also have the option of unlimited marking for any kind of essay after the program ends all the way up to the exam. So the normal program, which I do usually, is me marking comparative essays just for the 4 weeks. But if you sign up before Monday, I'll mark anything you send me, text response, argument analysis, comparative, even after the program ends, all the way up till before the exam. So night before, if you're panicking, you can send me a question and I will be happy to answer it. And I can also guarantee that you will improve, because if you don't see a change in your English ability by the end, then I'll work with you one-on-one until you do. And that's a pretty good deal because my private students pay me a lot. Sorry if any of them are sitting here. I can say 1 or 2 people have already popped through requests in the form. So if you're considering it, definitely do it as fast as possible because I can't take everyone. So the further on top of the list you are, the better. And the juiciest part of today, what about the free secret notes that I promised you all? Have you ever noticed that the notes doc that you guys have tells you everything about the Crucible and The Dressmaker, but there aren't any notes on actually structuring, writing, or studying for comparative? Thank you very much for attending, everyone. As soon as I have looked at the participant list, you guys will be getting an annotated example 9 or 10 out of 10 essay. And it's going to be explaining in detail every sentence you need to write to create a fabulous comparative essay. It's going to have lots of examples, lots of vocab you can copy into your own writing. You can take out all the same ideas. It'll be similar to what we worked on today. So you'll have like a really actionable look at what a really good essay would actually look like. It's super helpful, especially if your school doesn't give you a lot of example essays. And just for fun, I decided to also chuck in a general how to study guide in the last few weeks up until the exam. So, best of luck, everybody. You guys have been very special to me for turning up. It means a lot. I really enjoy teaching this stuff. So I'm so grateful that you are here. And also thank you for giving me your time because I know it's really, really valuable in year 12. If you're interested, again, fill in the form. And otherwise, keep enjoying my notes. Thanks so much, everyone.